Welcome back. You know, if you think back to our deep dives on starting conversations, we covered some really great openers, but what happens next?
That's a great question. Getting a conversation going is one thing, but keeping it flowing smoothly and authentically, well, that's where it gets really interesting.
Totally, and it can be tricky.
Yeah.
You don't want to fall into that interview style back and forth. Luckily, you shared some fantastic source material that I think will really help.
I think so too. And what I found fascinating was how these two sources, one very practical, the other more philosophical, actually complement each other so well.
Absolutely. There's a real art to conversation, and today we're going to help you unlock it. Okay, let's unpack the first source, which really digs into those common conversational pitfalls. I have to admit, I'm guilty of this one myself, stumbling through those "what's up" and "how are you" exchanges.
Oh, we've all been there. But what's key here is the source's emphasis on giving information rather than just asking questions. It's about shifting the dynamic from interrogation to invitation.
Right. I love how the source uses that example of introducing yourself at an event instead of the generic "what's up." Try saying something like, "It's my first time at this event. I thought I'd come say hi and meet some new people."
It's brilliant. You're instantly giving context and inviting the other person into your world. It's so much more engaging than just lobbing a question over the fence and hoping for a response.
Exactly. And speaking of engaging questions, the source then dives into what they call story-based questions. It's all about those what and how questions that really get people talking.
Think about a time someone asked you a question that really got you going. I bet it wasn't a simple yes or no. Open-ended questions like those starting with what or how tap into our memories, emotions, and experiences. They force us to think beyond a one-word answer.
It's true, and I think it ties into something pretty fundamental about how our brains work. When you ask someone, "Have you been to this event before?" You're asking for a fact, but if you ask, "What was it like last year?" suddenly you're inviting them to share a memory, an opinion, a story.
Exactly. It's like opening a door into their world, and who doesn't love sharing a good story? We get a glimpse into their perspective, their values, and even their sense of humor. It creates a connection that goes beyond just exchanging information.
You know, it's making me think about how we often approach conversations like a tennis match, just trying to get the ball back over the net as quickly as possible. But this source is encouraging us to slow down and really engage.
I completely agree, and it's not just about asking the right questions, it's also about how we respond. The source uses those terms energy draining and energy enhancing, which I thought was so insightful.
Yes. Can you elaborate on that a bit? I think that's a distinction a lot of people might not be aware of.
Think about it. Rapid-fire questions can make someone feel like they're being interrogated, especially if it's about surface-level things, but thoughtful responses, showing genuine curiosity, asking follow-up questions, those are all energy-enhancing.
So it's about making the other person feel seen and heard, not just like they're answering a survey.
Precisely. And this ties in beautifully with the concept of validation, which our second source, The Art of Conversation, really dives into. You know, when you validate someone's feelings or experiences, you're showing them that you're truly listening and that you value what they have to say.
It's so powerful.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are afraid to do that because they think it means they agree with everything the other person is saying. But it's not about agreement. It's about acknowledging their perspective and showing that you're trying to understand where they're coming from.
That's such an important point. Validation is about empathy, not necessarily endorsement. And the second source really emphasizes how crucial that is for building trust and connection.
You know, it strikes me that so much of what we've talked about so far comes down to generosity, being generous with our attention, our responses, our willingness to be open and vulnerable. And I think that's a really beautiful way to approach conversation.
Absolutely. And you know what? That reminds me of something else the second source talks about, which I think will surprise a lot of people. Active listening. Most of us think we're good listeners, but are we really?
Ooh, that's a good question. Tell me more about what the source says about active listening.
Well, it starts with a pretty mind-blowing statistic. Studies suggest that up to 93% of communication is nonverbal.
Wow, 93%. That's incredible. So all that stuff we've been talking about, tone of voice, body language, it's actually the majority of what we're communicating, not the words themselves.
Exactly. Our body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, they all speak volumes, often even more than our words. And active listening means tuning into all of those signals.
Okay, this is where I need your expertise. Give us some specific examples. What kind of nonverbal cues should we be paying attention to?
Well, for starters, let's talk about body language. Are they leaning in, showing interest, or are their arms crossed, creating a barrier? Eye contact is another big one. Are they meeting your gaze, or are they looking away?
I've never thought about it this way, but it's like we're all speaking a secret language we're not even aware of.
You got it. And then, of course, there's tone of voice. Are they speaking enthusiastically or hesitantly? Does their tone match their words? All of these subtle signals provide valuable information about how someone is truly feeling.
So active listening is about becoming a bit of a detective, reading between the lines and paying attention to all those nonverbal cues.
I like that analogy. It's not about overanalyzing every gesture, but about being attuned to the overall vibe and responding accordingly. It's about being present, engaged, and receptive to the whole message, not just the words being spoken.
It sounds like it takes a lot of focus and energy.
It does, but it's a skill that can be developed with practice, and the rewards are huge. When you become a truly active listener, you deepen your understanding of others, build stronger connections, and even avoid misunderstandings. It's a game changer in all aspects of life.
You convinced me. I'm definitely going to be paying more attention to those nonverbal cues from now on.
I think you'll be amazed at what you notice. It's like suddenly having access to a whole new level of understanding.
And speaking of understanding, the art of conversation also has some really interesting things to say about navigating disagreement. Because let's face it, not every conversation is going to be all sunshine and roses.
That's right. Disagreements are inevitable, but how we handle them can make all the difference. And this source offers some really practical advice on how to do that effectively.
Okay, give us the goods. What are some of the key takeaways?
Well, first and foremost, it emphasizes the importance of staying calm and respectful, even when you strongly disagree. It's so easy to let emotions get the better of us, but that rarely leads to a productive conversation.
So no yelling matches or personal attacks.
Exactly. Instead, the source suggests focusing on the issue at hand, not the person, and try to understand their perspective, even if you don't agree with it.
It all goes back to that validation we were talking about, right?
Absolutely.
Oh.
Even if you completely disagree with someone, you can still validate their feelings and acknowledge their right to hold a different opinion. It's a powerful way to de-escalate tension and keep the conversation respectful.
I like that. It's like saying, I hear you, I understand where you're coming from, even if I don't share your view.
Exactly. And that simple act of validation can make a huge difference in how the conversation unfolds.
This is great stuff. I feel like we're really starting to get into the deeper layers of what makes a conversation truly meaningful and productive. We've covered so much ground already, from avoiding those conversational dead ends to the power of open-ended questions, the art of validation, and the importance of active listening. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But what I love about this deep dive is that it's not just about mastering techniques, it's about bringing our true selves to the conversation. Both sources emphasize the importance of authenticity and vulnerability.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. I feel like that's something a lot of people struggle with, especially in today's world, where it's so easy to hide behind a carefully curated online persona.
Absolutely, but the reality is that people can sense when you're being fake or putting on a facade. Authenticity breeds trust and connection, and sometimes that means being vulnerable, sharing our own experiences and perspectives, even if they're different from the other person's.
So it's about having the courage to be ourselves, flaws and all.
Exactly. Vulnerability can be scary, but it's also incredibly powerful when we allow ourselves to be seen, flaws, and all it creates space for others to do the same, and that's where true connection happens.
I love that. It's about dropping the pretense and having a real human connection.
You got it, because ultimately that's what we're all craving, isn't it? To be seen, heard, and understood for who we truly are.
Okay, so we've tackled those common conversational pitfalls, explored the power of story-based questions, the art of validation, and the importance of active listening. But we're just getting started.
There's still so much more to explore. I'm really excited to dive into some specific strategies for navigating difficult conversations.
Me too. I'm ready to level up my conversation game.
Let's do it.
Great. But for now, let's take a quick break and come back to uncover even more secrets of masterful conversation.
It's interesting, we often think about conversations as these separate events, but they're really more like threads in a larger tapestry.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I've never thought of it that way before.
Each interaction, no matter how brief, contributes to the overall fabric of our relationships and our lives, and that's why it's so important to be mindful of how we communicate, even in those seemingly insignificant moments.
So true. And speaking of mindful communication, I'm really curious to dive into those strategies for navigating difficult conversations you mentioned earlier, because let's be real, sometimes things get tricky.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where those communication skills we've been talking about really come into play, because when emotions run high, it's easy to let things spiral out of control.
Okay, so how do we prevent that? Give us the inside scoop. What does the source recommend for handling those tough talks?
Well, it starts with recognizing that difficult conversations are difficult. It's natural to feel anxious or apprehensive going into them, but the key is to approach them with a clear head and a willingness to listen.
Easier said than done, right? Especially when you're in the heat of the moment.
You're telling me, but that's where preparation comes in. The source suggests taking some time to really think through what you want to say and how you want to say it, and just as importantly, consider the other person's perspective. What are their concerns? What are they hoping to achieve?
That's such a good point. It's easy to get caught up in our own heads and forget that the other person has their own valid feelings and motivations.
Exactly, and when we take the time to consider those things, it can really shift our approach and help us communicate more effectively.
So we've got our clear heads. We've considered both perspectives. What's next? How do we actually start the conversation?
Well, this is where that active listening we talked about earlier becomes crucial. The source emphasizes the importance of starting by truly hearing the other person out without interrupting or jumping to conclusions. Let them express their thoughts and feelings fully before you share your own.
That makes sense. It's hard to feel heard if someone is constantly interrupting or trying to steer the conversation in a particular direction.
Exactly. And this is where validation can also be incredibly helpful. Even if you don't agree with everything the other person is saying, acknowledge their feelings and let them know that you understand their perspective.
It's about creating a safe space where everyone feels respected and heard, even when there are disagreements.
Precisely. And from there, you can start to explore common ground and work towards resolution. The source emphasizes the importance of focusing on the issue at hand, not the person. It's not about winning or losing. It's about finding a solution that works for everyone involved.
That's so important. It's easy to let things get personal, especially when emotions are running high, but ultimately that just creates more conflict and resentment.
Exactly. And the source offers some really practical tips for keeping things constructive. For example, using I statements instead of you statements can help to de-escalate tension and make the conversation feel less accusatory.
Oh, that's a great tip. Can you give me an example of how that might work in practice?
Sure, instead of saying, "You're always late," you could say, "I feel stressed and frustrated when I'm waiting for you."
That's such a subtle shift,
Yeah.
but it makes a huge difference. It takes the focus off blaming the other person and puts it on expressing your own feelings.
Exactly. And it invites the other person to empathize with your experience, which can help to open up a more productive dialogue.
This is so helpful. I'm already feeling more equipped to handle those tough conversations.
Me too. And you know what? It all comes back to those foundational skills we were talking about earlier. Active listening validation, being present, and expressing ourselves authentically. When we have those tools in our toolbox, we're much better prepared to navigate even the most challenging conversations.
It's like having a superpower.
You got it. And the more we practice those skills, the more natural and effortless they become.
Well, I, for one, am feeling inspired to go out and have some really meaningful conversations, even the tough ones.
That's fantastic. And you know what? I think we've got time to squeeze in one more super important concept from the sources before we wrap up the power of mindful silence.
Ooh, I love this one. Silence often gets a bad rap in conversations, but the source is suggesting that it can actually be a really powerful tool.
Exactly. We live in a world that's constantly bombarded with noise and distractions. It's rare to find moments of true stillness, especially in conversations, but those moments can be incredibly valuable.
So how do we incorporate more mindful silence into our conversations?
Hell, it starts with simply being aware of the impulse to fill every silence with words. We often feel this pressure to keep the conversation going, but sometimes it's more beneficial to just pause and let things sink in.
It's like giving ourselves and the other person space to breathe and process what's been said.
Exactly, and that can lead to deeper insights and more meaningful connections. The source even suggests that sometimes the most powerful communication happens in the silences between words.
I love that. It's about trusting that the conversation will unfold organically without forcing it.
You got it. And you know what? This reminds me of something else the source touches on, which I think is so important, the art of nonverbal communication.
Oh, yes. We were talking earlier about how much of our communication is actually nonverbal, but how do we actually use that to our advantage in conversations?
Well, it starts with being aware of our own nonverbal cues. What are we communicating with our body language, our facial expressions, our tone of voice? Are those cues aligned with the message we're trying to convey?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us are completely oblivious to what our bodies are doing while we're talking. We're so focused on the words that we forget about all the other signals we're sending out.
It's true, but the reality is that those nonverbal cues can have a huge impact on how our message is received. And once we're aware of our own cues, we can start to be more intentional about using them to enhance our communication.
So it's like learning a whole new language.
Exactly, and it's a language that everyone understands regardless of their cultural background or language proficiency.
It's universal. Okay, so give us some practical tips. How can we use nonverbal communication to our advantage in conversations?
Well, one of the most important things is to make sure our nonverbal cues are congruent with our words. If we're saying one thing, but our body language is saying something else, it creates confusion and mistrust. So if we're expressing excitement, our facial expressions and tone of voice should reflect that. If we're offering support, our body language should be open and inviting.
It's about being authentic and letting our true feelings shine through in our nonverbal communication.
Exactly. And when our words and our nonverbal cues are aligned, it creates a sense of harmony and authenticity that's incredibly powerful.
Okay, so congruence is key. What else should we be paying attention to?
Well, eye contact is another big one. Maintaining appropriate eye contact shows that we're engaged and interested in what the other person is saying. But too much eye contact can feel intense or even aggressive, while too little can make us seem disinterested or untrustworthy.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot.
Exactly, and it can vary depending on the cultural context and the nature of the relationship. But as a general rule, it's good to aim for a balance between direct eye contact and looking away occasionally to give the other person a break.
That makes sense. What about body language? Are there any specific postures or gestures we should be aware of?
Well, as we talked about earlier, open body language conveys a sense of receptivity and warmth, while closed body language can signal defensiveness or disinterest. So things like uncrossed arms, leaning in slightly, and facing the other person directly can all help to create a more positive and engaging dynamic.
And imagine mirroring the other person's body language can also be helpful in building rapport.
Yes, absolutely. Subtly mirroring someone's posture or gestures can create a sense of connection and understanding. But it's important to do it. Subtly overt mimicking can come across as creepy or insincere.
So it's all about finding that delicate balance.
You got it. And ultimately, it comes down to being mindful of our nonverbal communication and using it intentionally to enhance our interactions.
It's like having a secret weapon.
Exactly. And when we combine those nonverbal skills with the verbal communication techniques we've been talking about, we create a truly powerful toolkit for building meaningful connections and navigating any conversation with grace and confidence.
Well, I have to say this deep dive has been a revelation. I'm walking away with so many valuable insights and practical strategies that I can't wait to put into practice.
Me too. And you know what the beauty of it is? That this is just the beginning. There's always more to learn and explore when it comes to the art of conversation. It's a lifelong journey of discovery and growth. So true. And the more we invest in developing these skills, the richer and more rewarding our interactions will be. Okay, so we've covered so much ground today, from those basic conversational building blocks to the nuances of nonverbal communication and the art of navigating difficult conversations. But I think we've got time for one final nugget of wisdom from the sources before we wrap things up. Are you ready for this?
Bring it on. I'm always up for a little more conversational wisdom.
Okay, here it is. The source emphasizes the importance of embracing imperfection.
Ooh, I love that. It's so easy to get caught up in trying to be perfect communicators, but the reality is that perfection is an illusion.
And it's also kind of boring.
Exactly. It's our imperfections that make us unique and interesting. And when we embrace those imperfections, we allow ourselves to be more authentic and vulnerable, which ultimately leads to deeper connections.
So it's about giving ourselves permission to be human.
Yes, to stumble over our words, to make mistakes, to not always have the perfect response. It's in those moments of imperfection that true connection often happens. That's such a liberating thought. It takes the pressure off trying to be perfect and allows us to just be ourselves.
Exactly. And you know what? That reminds me of something else the source talks about, which I think is so important: the power of humor.
Oh, yes. Humor is such a gift.
Yeah.
It can diffuse tension, lighten the mood, and create a sense of connection and shared joy.
Absolutely. And the source encourages us to not take ourselves too seriously in conversations, to be willing to laugh at ourselves, to find the humor in everyday situations, and to use humor to connect with others.
It's about bringing a sense of playfulness and lightheartedness to our interactions.
You got it. And you know what? When we approach conversations with that kind of spirit, it can transform even the most mundane interactions into something special.
This has been such an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about myself as a communicator, and I'm excited to put all of these insights into practice.
Me too. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. There's always more to learn and explore when it comes to the art of conversation. So keep practicing, keep experimenting, and keep having those meaningful conversations.
Great. Let's take a quick break and come back to wrap things up and leave our listener with some final thoughts to ponder. All right, we're back. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling energized and ready to go out and have some amazing conversations.
Me too. It's amazing how much there is to learn about something we do every single day.
It really is, and I think it's a testament to how powerful conversation is. It's not just about exchanging information. It's about connecting, understanding, and building relationships.
And having fun. We talked about the importance of humor and playfulness, and I think that's something we could all use a little more of in our lives.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the art of conversation, I want to leave our listener with a challenge.
Ooh, I like a good challenge. What do you have in mind?
I think we've all had those conversations that just felt good, where you felt seen, heard, and understood. I want you to think about a recent conversation like that. What made it so special? Was it the topic, the person you were talking to? Or maybe it was something less tangible, like a feeling of connection or shared energy.
That's a great question. And as you reflect on that conversation, see if you can identify any of the elements we've discussed today. Were you practicing active listening? Did you ask open-ended questions? Were you being authentic and vulnerable?
The more we understand what makes for a great conversation, the more we can consciously create those experiences in our own lives.
Exactly. It was like having a recipe for amazing conversations. And remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about being intentional.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
So keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep exploring.